and we'll drift in. Couldn't do much of anything anyway, even our shop out there won't hold air. But we can have light. We've got acetylene emergency lamps, you know, and we don't need to economize on oxygen." "Perhaps we'd better run in the dark. Remember what you told me about their possible visirays, and that you've got only 2 bombs left?" "All X, that would be better. If I forget it, remind me to blow up those before we hit the atmosphere of Ganymede, will you?" He opened all the power switches, and every source of ethereal vibrations cut off. The forlorn hope drifted slowly on, now appearing forlorn indeed. 7 hours dragged past, 7 age-long hours during which the two sat tense, expecting they knew not what, talking only at intervals and in subdued tones. Stevens then snapped on the communicator beam just long enough to take an observation upon Ganymede. Several such brief glimpses were taken. Then, after a warning word to his companion, he sent out and exploded the nitrogen bombs. He then threw on the power, and the vessel leaped toward the satellite under full acceleration. Close to the atmosphere, it slanted downward in a screaming 1,500-mile drive, and soon the mangled wedge dropped down into the little canyon which for so long had been home. "Well, Colonel, home again," Stevens exulted as he neutralized the controls. "There's that falls, our power plant, the catapults and everything. Now, unless something interrupts us again, we'll run up our radio tower and give Brandon the long yell." "How much more have you got to do before you can start sending?" "Not an awful lot. Everything built, all I've got to do is assemble it. I should be able to do it easily in a week. Hope nothing else happens. If I drag you into any more such messes as those we've just been getting out of by the skin of our teeth, I'll begin to wish that we had started out at first to drift it back to Tellus in the Hope. Let's see how much time we've got. We should start shooting one day after an eclipse, so that we'll have 5 days to send. You see, we don't want to point our beam too close to Jupiter, or to any of the large satellites, because the enemy might live there and might intercept it. We had an eclipse yesterday, so 1 week from today, at sunrise, I start shooting." "But Earth's an evening star now. You can't see it in the morning." "I'm not going to aim at Tellus. I'm shooting at Brandon, and he's never there for more than a week or 2 at a stretch. They're prowling around out in space somewhere almost all the time." "Then how can you possibly hope to hit them?" "It may be quite a job of hunting, but not as bad as you might think. They probably aren't much, if any, outside the orbit of Mars, and they usually stay within a couple of million kilometers or so of the ecliptic, so we'll start at the sun and shoot our beam in a spiral to cover that field. We ought to be able to hit them inside of 12 hours, but if we don't, we'll widen our spiral and keep on trying until we do hit them." "Heavens, Steve, are you planning on telegraphing steadily for days at a time?" "Sure, but not by hand, of course. I'll have an automatic sender and automatic pointers." Stevens had at his command a very complete machine shop. He had an ample supply of power, and all that remained for him to do was to assemble the parts which he had built during the long journey from Titan to Ganymede. Therefore, at sunrise of the designated day, he was ready, and with Nadia hanging breathless over his shoulder, he closed the switch. A toothed wheel engaged a delicate interrupter, and a light sounder began its strident shatter. "Ganymede, .047. Ganymede, .047. Ganymede, .047. Endlessly the message was poured out into the ether, carried by a tight beam of ultra-vibrations and driven by forces sufficient to propel it well beyond the opposite limits of the orbit of Mars. "What does it say? I can't read code." Stevens translated the brief message, but Nadia remained unimpressed. "But it doesn't say anything," she protested. "It isn't addressed to anybody. It isn't signed. It doesn't tell anybody anything about anything." "It's all there, Ace. You see, since the beam is moving sidewise very rapidly at that range, and we're shooting at a small target, the message has to be very short, or they won't get it all while the beam's on 'em. It isn't as though we were broadcasting. It doesn't need any address, because nobody but the Sirius can receive it, except possibly the Jovians. They'll know who's sending it without any signature. It tells them that Ganymede wants to receive a message on the ultra band centering on 47 thousandths. Isn't that enough?" "Maybe. But suppose some of them live right here on Ganymede. You'll be shooting right through the ground all night. Or suppose that, even if they don't live here, that they can find our beam some way. Or suppose that Brandon hasn't got his machine built yet. Or suppose that it isn't turned on when our beam passes them. Or suppose they're asleep then. A lot of things might happen." "Not so many, Ace. Your first objection is the only one that hasn't got more holes in it than a sieve, so I'll take it first. Since our beam is only a meter in diameter here, and doesn't spread much in the first few million kilometers, the chance of direct reception by the enemy, even if they do live here on Ganymede, is infinitesimally small. But I don't believe that they live here. At least, they certainly didn't land on this satellite. As you suggest, however, it is conceivable that they may have detector screens delicate enough to locate our beam at a distance. But since, in all probability, that means a distance of hundreds of thousands of kilometers, I think it highly improbable. We've got to take the same risk anyway, no matter what we do, whenever we start to use any kind of driving power, so there's no use in worrying about it. As for your last two objections, I know Brandon and I know Westfall. Brandon will have receivers built that will take in any wave possible of propagation, and Westfall, the cautious old egg, will have them running 24 hours a day, with automatic recorders, finders, and everything else that Brandon can invent. And believe me, sweetheart, that's a lot of stuff." "It's wonderful, the way you three men are," replied Nadia thoughtfully, reading between the lines of Stephen's utterance. "They knew that you were on the Arcturus, of course, and they knew that if you were alive, you'd manage in some way to get in touch with them. And you, away out here after all this time, are superbly confident that they are expecting a call from you. That, I think, is one of the finest things I ever heard of." "They're two of the world's best, absolutely." Nadia looked at him surprised, for he had not seen anything complimentary to himself in her remark. "Wait until you meet them. They're men, Nadia, real men. And speaking of meeting them, please try to keep on loving me after you meet Norm Brandon, will you?" "Don't be a simp." Her brown eyes met his steadily. "You didn't mean that. You didn't even say it, did you?" "Back it comes, sweetheart. But knowing myself, and knowing those two—" "Stop it. If Norman Brandon or Quincy Westfall had been here instead of you, or both of them together, we'd have been here from now on. We wouldn't even have gotten away from the Jovians." "Now it's your turn to backwater, Guy." "Well, maybe, a little. If both of them were here, they ought to equal you in some things. Brandon says himself that he and Westfall together make one scientist. Dad says he says so." "You don't want to believe everything you hear. Neither of them will admit that he knows anything or can do anything. That's the way they are. Dad has told me a lot about them, how they've always been together ever since their undergraduate days. How they studied together all over the world, even after they'd been given all the degrees loose. How they even went to the other planets to study, to Mars, where they had to live in spacesuits all the time, and to Venus, where they had to take ultraviolet treatments every day to keep alive. How they learned everything that everybody else knew, and then went out into space to find out things that nobody else ever dreamed of. How you came to join them, and what you three have done since. They're fine, of course, but they aren't you. she concluded passionately.